Welcome to another episode of Conversations with Coleman. I'm your host, Coleman Hughes. So, needless to say, these are grim times. I'm speaking now 9 days after the death of George Floyd at the hands of Minneapolis police officers, and over a week into the massive protests as well as riots that have ensued as a result. I plan to do a long solo episode on everything that has occurred and what I think of the Black Lives Matter movement and the broader discourse surrounding race in this country. Please do consider supporting the podcast at colemanhughes.org. I'm delighted to see that many of you have switched over from Patreon. As I said last episode, I hope to get as many of you as possible to support me directly through my website, rather than using Patreon as a middleman. And if you can't or don't want to support, that's completely okay. You can also help me by subscribing to my YouTube page. So please do that if you're so inclined. My guest today is perfectly placed to talk about everything that's going on in this moment. He is a Harvard psychologist and a superstar intellectual. He's written books like How the Mind Works, The Blank Slate, The Better Angels of Our Nature, and Enlightenment Now. The man I'm talking about is Dr. Steven Pinker. I've been a fan of Steve Pinker for a long time, so I'm happy to finally get him on the podcast. Steve and I talk about how this moment compares to others in American history. Steve is cautiously optimistic about the COVID crisis and about the riots. I agree with him on the first one, but I'm much more pessimistic on the second one, and we talk about that. We talk about ways of reducing police shootings in the future. We talk about the massive coverage bias of police shootings in the media. That is the phenomenon of the media only reporting instances of cops shooting civilians when the victim is Black. We talk about the connection between Steven's famous book on human nature, The Blank Slate, and his later books on progress, which on their face seem in tension. We talk about the enormous progress that's been made in reducing poverty, racism, and other social ills. We talk about whether violence is necessary in order to foster progress, which is a popular idea right now. We talk about what the causes of crime are. We talk about the idea of prison abolitionism. We talk about barbaric punishments and the possibility of substituting corporal punishments for prison, which sounds bizarre but makes sense in the context of the conversation. We talk about times when utilitarian reasoning goes too far. We talk about the lead crime hypothesis and the progress we've made in incarceration, as well as the progress we still have to make. So without further ado, Dr. Steven Pinker. Thank you so much for being on the podcast.
Oh, thanks for having me, Coleman.
So we are speaking on June 1st, over 2 months into the coronavirus lockdown. We are speaking a week after George Floyd was killed by police in Minneapolis, sparking protests in just about every major city across the nation. I can't lie. I despair for the country right now. I feel that this is a moment where we've seen a lot of we've seen a lot of ugliness and a lot of beauty, and it's a moment where it feels very bizarre and heavy to be an American. So it's at the same time I'm grateful to be talking to you, because all of the themes that are motivating this moment are themes that you've been dealing with more or less your entire career, or your entire career as a writer for a general audience, namely violence and the motivation for violence, the purpose of police forces, the facts and myths surrounding progress. So I didn't schedule you with the intention of talking about this, but given current events, I think you're the perfect person to talk to about these things.
Well, it is certainly a bizarre and troubling moment in American history. we've had bizarre and troubling moments before. When I was a child, I lived through the urban riots of the late 60s and the assassinations occurring against the backdrop of an actual shooting war in Vietnam. So I've lived through the two gas shortages in 73 and 79 when tempers were fraying and people were lining up around the block for gas and no one knew whether there'd be enough fuel for heating oil. Again, there were wars going on, including a war in the Middle East in 1973 between Israel and neighboring countries that resulted in the President of the United States putting nuclear forces on alert. There was, in 1979, there was the after the Iranian Revolution, the hostage crisis, and a war between Iran and Iraq that began in the early 80s, that where the talk then was that a single oil tanker sunk in the Straits of Hormuz would choke the flow of oil from the rest of the world at a time in which the world was completely dependent on Middle Eastern oil. So we lived through bizarre and dangerous periods before, to say nothing of World War II, the events that my parents lived through. So while not minimizing the bizarre and challenging and horrific events today, before we despair, we should realize that we have gotten through far more dangerous periods in the past. Now we are certainly living through a dangerous one now. It's hard for me even to believe that we've now endured almost 3.5 years of the presidency of Donald Trump, and too soon to predict what will happen. But simply, I would think above and beyond the policies that I've been deploring, just having someone as the symbolic leader of the country who is less divisive, who is better able to bring people together, would do something to calm the national mood. And there are the two huge challenges we're facing as you and I speak today, namely the a once-in-a-century pandemic and a re-eruption of urban violence following a police shooting. We should see these as solvable problems, as not easily solvable, but there are more than 70 efforts now to develop a vaccine for the disease. There will be better antivirals, almost certainly, and together with public health measures such as testing, tracing, and supported isolation, and sanitation and social distancing, that we have every reason to believe we'll bring it under control. We don't know yet what life will be like when the vaccines are discovered. Much will depend on whether these are the kind of vaccines that give you lifetime immunity, or they're more like flu vaccines that are partially effective and have to be boosted and redone every year. And in the case of police violence, it's shocking how little we've done since the issue came to people's attention starting in 2014 with Ferguson. Again, although there's little hope that the current federal administration is going to do something about it, there's reason to believe that there are measures that can reduce it. Oregon has reduced its police shootings from a dozen or more a year to 0. And whereas 6 years ago, we were in a state of almost complete ignorance about what does and doesn't reduce police shootings, we're starting to get some sense as to what works and what doesn't. Just the fact that we can compare our country against others, which have a fraction of the number of police shootings, suggests that there's got to be a solution that's out there.
So I take your point about coronavirus and the vaccines, and I've heard some optimistic noises from Dr. Fauci suggesting that best case we could see a vaccine by very early next year. Unfortunately, I don't feel as optimistic about the rioting problem for the following reason, and I hope you can perhaps talk me out of this pessimism. But what I see is that there are broadly two conditions that combined create the circumstances for a riot to erupt. And the first condition is that there is a perception that the police are deeply racist and unfair to Black Americans. Now, we can talk about how true that perception is. I think there are true elements to it and false elements to it, but the condition here is the perception. And that perception is, I think, likely to stay with us for some time. And then the second condition to me seems to be the reality of policing in modern America. And the reality of policing, I think there's a few elements that are relevant. One is the fact that we're an enormous country population-wise, which means that events that have very low probabilities of happening will happen 10 times more often in America than they will in Canada, even with the same probability. And because we register anything happening in America as happening here in the relevant sense, it can seem like something is happening much more often simply by virtue of our huge size. There's the fact that America has a unique gun culture, which means part of what that means is our police have a heightened fear of coming across a gun when they're apprehending a suspect, which means they're much more likely to mistake the wallet for a gun. And I don't see how that, even in the best circumstances, goes away. And then there's the fact that now everyone is a journalist. So anytime in any city an altercation goes down between police and civilians, multiple people are going to immediately record it. And to be clear, I think that's a net good. However, it means that any altercation will immediately go viral, certainly between a white cop and a Black suspect. And so the reality of policing combined with the perception of racism, I'm not sure which of those is well, to put a just a final gloss on my point. Last year, there were 9 unarmed Black Americans, according to the Washington Post database, that were killed. My impression is because of the reality of policing, getting from 9 to, for example, 0 is going to be probably harder than getting from 20 to 9. And so long as there are any of these incidents in an American city during the hot summer months, I don't see how we can get around the possibility that riots will be a recurring feature of American life for the foreseeable near future, so long as all of these conditions obtain.
Well, I don't disagree, but with any of the facts and analyses that you've presented, that it is true that our perception of risk and prevalence is driven by stories, events, anecdotes rather than data. And with a combination of a big country and every citizen being a reporter, we can have the impression that things are much more common than they are. And indeed, since Ferguson, since Michael Brown, there has been perceptions of violence perpetrated by cops that you and I know are inconsistent with the statistical reality. Among them, that a major risk to the lives of African Americans is shooting by police, whereas it's probably at least 15 times more likely that a man will be killed by someone who's not a police officer than a police officer. So the fear that police are a major threat to life and limb is out of whack with the reality. And there are at least 4 studies that I know of that show no good evidence for racial bias in who gets shot by police, or for that matter, in which police shoot. But perception matters. You're absolutely right. And as long as, and we know that there clearly is racism in American police, but there's also trigger happiness in American police. American police just shoot too many people. And you combine that with the unequal distribution of crime across regions of the United States, across ethnic groups. I mean, just like any other social science statistic, you break it down by region, you break it down by ethnicity, you break it down by age, you break it down by sex. The numbers are never the same. So there will always be statistical discrepancies, and they can inflame public reaction depending on how much they are covered. So the ingredients are there, particularly when you've got a culture of policing in the United States that is far too quick to use deadly force. You know, I remember when I was in the 1980s, there was this fantastic television program called Hill Street Blues, often credited as one of the first, like really artfully scripted ensemble shows about a police force in a crime-prone urban district. This took place before the Great American Crime Decline, when violent crime was more than twice, 2 to 4 times as high as it is today. And so violent crime was just a backdrop to urban life, which made the series all the more poignant. But I always wondered when I was watching it how whenever there was a suspect who fled on foot, they always had one of the officers in the show chasing him down on foot and tackling him, including cases where the suspect was young and the police officer was not so young. I thought, wow, isn't that amazing that our police can outrun any suspect and tackle him? And what I should have realized even back then was that's just not the way the police operate. When there's all too often when there's a suspect, they shoot. And now so while not disputing any of your points, including that the ingredients are all there, there are ways of that can bring down rates of police shooting, and therefore, depending on the coverage, and you're right that the number could go down, but the ones that do occur, as long as it doesn't go to zero, can still be highly publicized. But there are ways of training police to forbear the use of deadly force until other alternatives are tried, getting mental health professionals rather than police officers to de-escalate confrontations with mentally ill people, which are a reasonable fraction of victims of deadly police violence, of getting better data reporting, because one of the things that I discovered as a kind of a data wonk on, including on violence, is how crummy our data are on police shootings. You cited one of the best sources, the Washington Post's journalistic database, but really we ought to have police departments themselves and the federal government compiling an accurate database. We don't have that. But it is possible to reduce the rate substantially, although you're right that it will also depend on how that change is covered, given that it may not be visible in particular anecdotes. But a lot of things that seem, as they're occurring, they seem like they're going to always be with us, and they'll just mark urban or life indefinitely. Do have a way of petering out. The urban riots of the 60s, which looked like they were going to be just a permanent feature of American cities, fizzled out, although with outbursts such as after the Rodney King acquittal in 1992 and after Ferguson and what we've just seen in the last couple of days. But when you're living through the worst of something, it's easy to imagine that it's a new normal, but it isn't necessarily. Likewise, it's difficult to believe that just like 3 years ago, the big concern was terrorist attacks by Islamist groups. And that looked like it was going to change life forever. At least for a while, those have dropped off the radar screen. Again, we're talking about, but you're right, we're talking about rare events. And here, the frequency may not be as important in driving public reaction as the publicity and the narratives.
Yeah, I am. I take your point. I think there are definitely ways of probably reducing the number of unarmed Americans killed by the police, and I'm interested in all of those potential reforms. But I'm also interested in whether there is a way to get the media in particular to eliminate their coverage bias on these issues. So, for example, there was a white man named Tony Timpa. I'm not sure if you've seen this video, who in 2016 was captured on the body cam, I believe, of a cop who was killed in almost exactly the same way that George Floyd was. Namely, the cop was on his back, pinning him down with his neck for 13 minutes and suffocated him to death. All the while, Tony Timpa was begging for his life, and in fact, the cops were making jokes throughout the whole time. It's every bit as disturbing to watch as the George Floyd video. And the video was kept secret for 3 years and released in 2019, I believe, on the order of a federal judge. Of course, that didn't inspire riots. So far as I know, the video didn't even go viral because it wasn't clearly racist, because it was a white cop doing it to a white suspect. And I fear that, part of the reason that Black Americans in particular, but Americans in general, react this way to the video is because we've been primed to think that this is only a race issue rather than an issue with the police in general, which is to say there's an accountability there's an accountability issue. Often it's police departments investigating themselves, rather than having an independent body investigating examples of potential misconduct. And I don't know how to get the media to cover all of these cases, but I think that would go a long way to persuading Americans that this is an issue you can get behind regardless of what your race is. And I think that would go at least part way to preventing this kind of rioting.
I couldn't agree with you more. I think that journalism needs to be far more numerate and statistically savvy, and ensure that its coverage is in more harmony with the actual data. And I think indeed that I haven't seen polling results, but I wouldn't be surprised if people thought that more African Americans were shot by police than whites, when it's the other way around. Now, of course, the rate per capita is higher for African Americans than for whites. But on the other hand, the rate of violent crime is higher for African Americans than for whites, as it is for Southerners versus Northerners. Those are the two great statistical disparities in crime statistics in the United States. So that the base rates have to be taken into account. But I think that you're right, from the coverage, the fact that the more than half the police shootings that are of white suspects never get coverage has distorted people's perception, as is just the absolute risk of getting shot by a police officer, as opposed to being shot by a gang member or someone that you get into a fight with in a bar, which is, as I mentioned, 15 times greater.
Mm. So you've I guess you're most known in the general public as someone who has written books about the fact of progress. And
well, it's a recent kind of notoriety, because most of my career I've been a cognitive scientist and a psycholinguist. I've written books on language. I've written books on the human mind. I've written books on irregular verbs and on the meanings of words, and swearing, and euphemism and innuendo, and all kinds of subjects. But I have written two books that were data-driven books on human progress, one concentrating on violence, the other on measures of human well-being. Both really growing out of one thing leads to another when you're an academic. It's one of the great things about being an academic, is that you can follow your curiosity. In my case, there was an interest in human nature that came from my interest in language, a quintessentially human trait. Human nature brings up political and philosophical questions like, are we basically good? Are we basically selfish? Are we cooperative? Are we rational? And I often had to deal with the hostility toward the very idea of human nature, because people tend to think it's a kind of reactionary doctrine. You can't change human nature. So what's the point of trying to improve the human condition? War is in our genes, so we'll never have peace. People can't cooperate because they're ruthless fitness maximizers. And so just what I find fascinating and intriguing and important, namely figuring out what makes people tick, face this kind of resistance on political and moral and emotional grounds. Oh no, don't tell me that we have any instincts towards vengeance or sex differences or self-serving biases, because that would just be too depressing to contemplate. That would mean there's no hope of it making life better. And so part of my counter argument was just, first of all, human nature is a complicated system. We don't just have one thing. So yeah, I think we are wired by evolution with a taste for revenge. And among certain genders, a desire for dominance. But that's not all we have. We also have a sense of empathy. We also have the faculty of self-control. We also have a sense of fairness. And what actually happens in any social milieu, it depends on an interplay between these different components of the mind. But also, there can't really be a debate as to whether we can change our lives, our social circumstances, because history tells us that we can. Life now isn't the same as life 100 years ago or 500 years ago. Slavery was abolished. World wars have, contrary to a lot of pessimistic predictions, have not taken place, and war in general is in decline. Rates of violence can go yo-yo up and down, and recently they've been way down, and other examples. So it was and once I began this effort of showing a couple of graphs documenting that we really have worked with the better angels of our nature, as Abraham Lincoln put it, and that's the title that I co-opted from my book on violence. It's possible to succeed, and then one thing led to another, and I got to say, to my own surprise, I came upon graph after graph showing how life really has improved over the decades and centuries. So it was a kind of a circuitous journey that took me from being interested in language and cognition to data on human progress.
Absolutely, yeah. So I saw a video yesterday that went viral of it was a group of 3 Black men, I forget in what city, during the protest, and one was in his early 40s, one was in his mid 20s, and one was a teenager. And the older one was saying to the younger one that there's been no change, there's been no progress. And the one in his 20s gave a very inspiring and poignant sort of speech to the 16-year-old, saying that our generation has failed. The same problems, whether we're talking about police violence or poverty, inequality, and so forth, are with us, that existed 50, perhaps 100 years ago. And so your generation has to come up with a way to sort of fix this. And the upshot of it was, a call for I suppose kind of peaceful reform. So in that sense, I agree with it. But there is the reason this struck a chord with so many people is because there is a widespread perception that we have not made progress on the issues that most people of goodwill want to see solved or at minimum made better, namely poverty, inequality, police violence, and so forth. So to what degree is that perception accurate?
Yeah, it's totally wrong. It's wrong. Sorry, I should qualify that. It's wrong to say there's no progress. It is right to say the problems remain. And you can improve something without having solved it. And indeed, that's the way societies work. There's no such thing as instantly solving a problem. You chip away at it, and the gains can increase, even compound, and it can lead to real progress even if you never noticed it happening on a particular day. So all the data on the lives of American racial minorities, particularly African Americans, show there has been improvement. The rate of poverty is down, rate of illiteracy is down, lifespan is up, happiness is up. Happiness for African Americans has increased, while happiness for white Americans has slightly decreased over the last 60 or 70 years. The gaps have shrunk, but they are absolutely still there. So the work is by no means done, to put it mildly, but it's also a mistake to say there's been no progress, that 70 years of efforts toward equality have been a waste of time. That would be, I think it's empirically false, and I think it's a dangerous message. Like, why even bother at reducing inequality, at increasing racial justice, if all of these efforts have been fruitless? And they have not been fruitless. And by the way, racism is way down. Again, that's, for something to decrease does not imply that it's disappeared. And if we know it hasn't disappeared. And even with what has shocked me as someone who has looked at data on racism, what shocked me is some of the taboos that have been breached toward expressing it, not least by our commander-in-chief. But even during the Trump years, polls on racism across the country have shown that it has continued to decline. Certainly the percentage of Americans who agree with overtly racist statements, like African Americans are less hardworking, continues to go down. The percentage who say, I would not want my child to marry a person of a different race, or that black and white kids shouldn't go to school together, all of them in decline, in some cases down to level, kind of crackpot levels. So you never get to zero, no matter how absurd the question is. If it's, aliens are beaming messages into my brain, then 3% of people will agree to that. And some of the old attitudes, like black and white kids should go to separate schools, have fallen to that level. At the same time, it is shocking, dispiriting that statements that even I would have thought would be just beyond the pale can have been made in public. Fortunately, those don't seem to be pushing the nationwide level back. I'll just add one thing, because this is obviously, you have to be wary of questionnaires that just ask people questions with an obviously socially desirable response. And a cynic could say, well, people haven't gotten less racist. They just are more aware that racism is considered to be bad, and so they hide their feelings. When someone on the phone calls and says, I'm with the General Social Survey, how do you answer these questions? But at least two measures that I've looked at of more hidden bias also show that it's in decline. One of them is by my colleague Mahzarin Banaji, the famous pioneer of the implicit attitudes test, a way of looking at implicit bias, who with one of her students, Tessa Charlesworth, they just looked at their own data over a period of 20 years at fairly subtle measures of bias coming out of reaction time studies of whether you associate black or white faces with positive or negative words. And they found that there's been a decline in racial bias over just the 20 years they've been doing the test. And then an analysis that I did with the help of Seth Stephens-Davidowitz, a Google data scientist, just how often people search for racist jokes on Google, where there's no social desirability bias because you're doing it in the privacy of your own keyboard. And for most people, racist jokes, they're not like a guilty pleasure. They're just kind of icky or sullying. You make an effort not to see them. And so it's a good index of deep in the marrow racism if you actually search for racist jokes, and the searches have gone down. So that's another kind of indirect indicator. Again, none of this means that racism has disappeared or that it's not a problem, just that there has been progress in marginalizing it.
Mm. So there's a certain kind of person that would hear that and say, okay, yes, I agree there's been progress. I agree American society is not where it was in 1960 or even 1980 or even 2000. But hasn't that progress been fostered by, in some cases, violent demonstration. We had to fight a civil war to end slavery. The riots in the late '60s, it shocked the American public into caring. Um, so why isn't it the case that violent demonstrations are warranted now, so as to foster more progress?
Yeah, and of course the problem is that history only runs once. We can't run alternative universes to see what would happen. But I don't think the chronology supports that. Of course, the great protests that led to the Civil Rights Act and all of the changes in 1964 and 1965 occurred after peaceful protests led by Martin Luther King and his collaborators. The riots began later, after the legislative accomplishments were in place. And I think there's good evidence that they were counterproductive in a number of ways. Number one is just in electing a president hostile to racial progress. In 1968, again, I lived through this as a child, but everyone thought that the big issue was the Vietnam War, and that Richard Nixon would be vulnerable because he was a Vietnam hawk. But he changed the narrative to his campaign slogan was law and order. People were appalled by the urban violence. They thought that we needed a strong president to deal with it, and Nixon, to the shock of many people, got elected. In 1988, when George H.W. Bush Sr. was elected, it came after a decade in which the crime rate had shot up. It shot up in the 60s and came down a little bit at the into the 70s, but high again in the 80s. And when Bush was elected, it was one of the high years for crime. And then even in 2016, although American crime rates had declined precipitously starting in 1992, there was a noticeable uptick in 15 and 16, which Trump capitalized on in his American carnage rhetoric. It felt like things were getting worse, even though relative to American history, violence rates were still down. But it led again to a reactionary movement. So, and this is not even counting the immediate harm done in minority communities when your grocery store and your local mom and pop shops are burned, and where you're going to shop for food, and who is going to open up a store in a neighborhood where it's likely to be looted and vandalized and burned down. So rioting is, I think, almost always a spectacularly stupid tactic. When it comes to more serious change, like actual regime change, there's a fascinating body of research by my colleague Erica Chenoweth, originally reported with Maria Stephan, that actually tabulated the success rate of violent and nonviolent resistance movements, and found that the success rate for the nonviolent ones was twice to 3 times as high as for violent ones. So it's not that the nonviolence always works, it's not that violence always fails, but in general, the track record goes with the nonviolent protest movements.
Mm. So I agree with all of that. Of course, I'm really trying to plumb the depths of the counter arguments here, to the counter arguments I'm talking about with my friends and seeing on Twitter. But I want to ask now a deep and basic question relating to human nature, and a kind of fundamental disagreement on what human nature is and how that relates to violence. And the question, which is deceptively simple, is what is the cause of crime? What causes people to commit crime? Does the question make sense? If so, why or why not? And just how do you view that? Because, and the context is, most people I talk to about this issue take it for granted that crime is, we know the causes of crime: poverty, inequality, systemic bias, hopelessness, despair. And I have no doubt that that is true in some cases, but I've been persuaded by many arguments that sort of hold that human nature can kind of just tend towards this to begin with. So where do you stand on that, and how do you think of that?
Yeah, there are different kinds of crime, and there are different people who commit them out of different motives. It is certainly true that a lot of crime occurs in poor neighborhoods, and poor people are more likely to commit violent crime. It's not necessarily true of violence in general, especially through history, when it used to be the aristocrats that had their armed retinues and would engage in contests of honor and revenge and dueling men of honor, as in the opening scene of Romeo and Juliet, when two aristocratic families have a street fight. So that's not a given, but it tends to be true now. In general, although there are many causes of crime, they're not all racism and inequality. Especially not when it comes to changes over time. The Great American Crime Decline, which began in 1992, which saw rates of violent crime plunge to half their levels. In New York, it plunged 75%. This was during a period of rising inequality. And even though there was a slight systemic decrease in racism, not enough to have brought crime rates down that quickly, 50% in 8 years. A lot of crime is opportunistic. There's a strong correlation between people who commit crime and lack of self-control. There's opportunity to rob a cash register. There's a fight over a parking space or over a pool table, and there's road rage, and then one person ends up dead. Policing matters. This was brought home to me as a teenager when I lost an argument with my parents on what would happen if the police disappeared, and I was at the time I had a kind of romantic anarchist sensibility from the Russian biologist Peter Kropotkin. That it was the presence of law and property and police that caused violence. My parents said, yeah, just you wait. If the police ever walked off the job, all hell would break loose. And it just so happened that in 1969, the Montreal police force they went on strike. And so we had a day without police, and all hell did break loose. There were 2 murders. There was widespread looting and vandalism and shooting. And in general, effective policing is as opposed to anarchy and a culture of honor and vendetta and revenge, are major factors in reducing crime. One of the reasons why the efficacy, the fairness, and the perception of fairness in policing is so important. That the police have their effect not so much by there being an armed officer on every corner, which no society could afford, but when people have confidence that their potential adversaries are also being deterred by the police, so they don't have to defend their own interests by being a kind of macho badass and retaliating against any insult with violence to prove the credibility of their own deterrent. When they can outsource revenge to a more disinterested third party, then rates of violence tend to go down. That only works when people have at least enough faith in the fairness of the overall system that they don't have to take the law into their own hands, as we say. A lot of violence is, there's some violence that's purely opportunistic and predatory. Someone robs a liquor store and shoots the cashier so they won't identify him in court. But an awful lot of violence is moralistic. There's an interesting analysis both of wars and of genocides and of street crime, that in many cases the perpetrator thinks that what they're doing is morally justifiable. That is, they are meting out justice to someone who deserves it. The asshole who cut you off in traffic, who's flirting with your girlfriend, who humiliated you in public, or more generally, the ethnic minority that is parasite on society, the country that is occupying territory that doesn't rightfully belong to them. One of the things about human nature is that our most moralistic impulses are often the sources of our worst violence. There's a fabulous book by Alan Fisk and Taj Rai called Virtuous Violence, which they're anthropologists and they look across cultures, and they find that there's an enormous amount of violence that people think is, in their view, it's justice.
Yeah. So normally I don't like to spend too much time, dealing with arguments that are only on the political fringes and unlikely to actually be instantiated. But I do think occasionally it's worth looking at the very fringe ideas, um, and actually dealing with them. So I guess two of those, one of those ideas you've already dealt with, which is to completely defund and abolish the police. This has almost no likelihood of actually happening. It's very fringe, even among Democrats. And your experience in Montreal and the experience of lawless places around the world, I think, testifies to the lack of wisdom of that idea, including the most dangerous neighborhoods in, for example, Chicago, according to a Wall Street Journal estimate, have a single digit percentage likelihood that any given murder is solved. And that should speak for itself in terms of, whether it's desirable to fully get rid of the police. But another fringe idea, which is not likely to be accepted, but is, I think, worth thinking about, is the abolition of prisons. What do you make of the necessity or utility of prisons? Can we get rid of them altogether? Can we reserve incarceration for only the most violent and horrific crimes while using other ways of sanction? What's your perception
Yeah.
of this movement?
Well, certainly reducing prison is a very worthy aim. I don't think any society, even the progressive ones like Norway and Portugal, have eliminated prisons altogether. But prison is a means to an end, that is of reducing violence. Traditionally, there have been 5 justifications for criminal punishment. One of them is sheer incapacitation. There are some people that are just so dangerous that we're just better off if they're off the street. And I think that's going to always be true. There are psychopaths. There are people who will rape and will kill people to rob them. Probably not the majority of prisoners by any means, but probably not zero either. So there's incapacitation. There's specific deterrence. You get thrown in jail, you're less likely to do it again. General deterrence, you hear that someone else has been punished for a crime, and so you think twice before you do it yourself. There's rehabilitation. Of course, our prisons barely do that at all. Probably the other way around. They probably school people in the ways of criminality, but that's one of the classic justifications for criminal punishment. And the final one is some notion of just deserts, whether it's you believe normatively that if you commit harm, you ought to be punished, or if there's just a general perception of the legitimacy of the rule of law. Should I take the law into my own hands and avenge a killing with a killing, which of course leads to cycles of vendetta and kind of the world of the Corleones? Or can I trust the criminal justice system to do it do it for me? And that depends on a perception that wrongdoers are punished. So anyway, that's just the classic theory. That does not mean that you have to throw someone in jail for 10 years for a property crime, for counterfeiting, or to say nothing of drug possession. So I think we would do well to figure out what is the amount of punishment that would serve the general and specific deterrence function without the enormous cost, excuse me, of maintaining prisons and all the expanding damage that does to families and communities. And there we really ought to look at experiments in other countries, mindful of the fact that not only is the United States a big country, but the United States does have a rate of, starts off with a rate of violent crime that is at least 5 times as high as most other Western democracies. So we can't automatically say, well, it works in Norway, let's try it here. Although we could try some of it and see how much it works, but we have to take into account the fact that we start off as a pretty violent country. Still, we could absolutely do better. And one of the oldest principles behind criminal justice, going back to Cesare Beccaria during the Enlightenment, who was, I think, the first really to articulate the logic of why we should have criminal punishment at all. He was the one who helped abolish sadistic, cruel forms of punishment like breaking on the wheel and burning at the stake and being pulled apart by horses, by noting that that's quite unnecessary for the actual purpose of criminal punishment, namely to deter wrongdoers. But one of the things he pointed out is that probability of punishment is far more important than severity of punishment. And often our first impulse is there's too much crime or wrongdoing of any kind. Therefore, let's just ratchet up how awful the punishment is. One of the problems, aside from the fact that when someone is caught, there can be a lot of gratuitous cruelty. The other problem is that if there's a tiny probability of a horrific punishment, people can just think of it as kind of like the risk of an accident. Yeah, it'd be horrible if I was in a car accident or a burning building, but I have to take my chances. And that's the way people think of severe punishment that's very unlikely. A higher probability of punishment, even if it's less severe, can be more effective in doing what we want punishment to do in the first place.
Right. If you knew you were going to break a finger every time you went for a drive, that would get people to not to drive, even though.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. I was astounded to come across. I've read a little bit of Cesare Beccaria. I've read more of Alexis de Tocqueville, writing in the 1830s, who, it's possible he got it from Cesare Beccaria, but states in very plain language the principle that you just described, that actually longer sentences don't work. He said it as if it were common knowledge in the 1830s, and as late as the 1990s and 2000s, I think many people still don't know this. I was also interested I came across a paper that sought to explain the origins of the phrase in the 13th Amendment that abolished slavery, except in abolished involuntary servitude, except in cases of when someone commits a crime, and traced it to Thomas Jefferson's Northwest Ordinance, where that language is lifted from, and traced Jefferson's use of that concept to his admiration for Cesare Beccaria, who proposed involuntary servitude as an alternative to the death penalty. So that the hypothesis, which I think makes sense, is that he inserted that phrase because out of a relative to the time sense of compassion for criminals, relegating them to a lifetime of labor rather than death. And that has...
That's fascinating. I was not aware of that, but I knew that there was a connection between Beccaria and also the Eighth Amendment against cruel and unusual punishment, which used to mean strapping someone to a wagon wheel and bashing his limbs with a sledgehammer till he died of shock and hemorrhage.
Yeah, I've heard. On the other hand, I've heard two criminologists who I admire. I think one of them, or perhaps he's a sociologist, Peter Moskos, have made the argument that flogging would actually be a more humane alternative than the status quo. It would be not only cheaper, but public flogging rather than incarceration would do all the deterrence that we want without all of the associated costs, both to the criminal and society, of incarceration. I'm not sure how much the argument is really serious or whether it's
Mhm.
meant as a poignant way to drive home the insanity of the status quo. But I wonder if you've come across that argument and what you think of it.
I haven't, although I have thought about it because we certainly have uh, kind of a taboo against corporal punishment in virtually every modern Western country. Uh, Partly because when flogging was practiced, it often would flay the skin off someone's back and just expose their half of their body as raw flesh with no skin. I mean, it was truly a form of almost unspeakable torture. But it is true, and I've thought of this. I'd rather endure some awful electric shocks, for example, or get a couple of lashes or caning than to give up several years of my life in prison. Uh, but nonetheless, there are times at which, when you do a utilitarian calculation, that is, what would be let's say it had the same deterrent value, and indeed some fewer costs, like taking someone out of the workforce, schooling them in criminality, devastating their families. So, why don't we bring back caning or flogging, or maybe electric shock, so it isn't a permanent uh, uh, tissue damage. The thing is that often we like to draw red lines and say, we're not going to allow our government to impose pain on someone, that there's something that just strikes us as inherently barbaric about the practice, and that could lead to a slippery slope toward much worse. So let's just draw a line around that and say governments are no longer allowed to do that entire category. And it is an interesting debate whether these kinds of categorical taboos do result in less suffering in the long run, as opposed to just sort of weighing up particular measures. By and large, I think I would not support a measure to allow governments to flog people. But anyway, I'd certainly be open to a discussion as to whether, say, some degree of corporal punishment might be preferable to the cruelty of long periods of incarceration. I doubt that I would end up supporting it, but it's something to think about.
Yeah, I wonder, even giving someone the choice between a prison sentence and some kind of corporal punishment, it would be interesting to see how many people chose one or the other, as, if nothing else, as a comment on what the status quo, how we should really feel about the status quo.
How many shocks would you endure to avoid a year in prison?
Yeah.
It's kind of beyond the realm of conventional polite discourse, but it might be worth thinking about it. And I agree with you. What you said is just right. If nothing else, to just calibrate how callous we might be in accepting incarceration. Maybe it's more cruel to send someone to prison, and by being reminded of what people would choose, we could kind of ramp up our empathy or mercy or sense of horror to incarceration.
So there's also, speaking of incarceration and progress, which is a big theme in your last two books, I came across data. I actually came across this data in a book by the economist Rick Nevin, who was hired by the government in the 90s to study the effect of lead on crime, and came to the conclusion that the increase in childhood lead poisoning in among children, in the, let's say, 40s, 50s, 60s, and 70s, accounted for the majority of both the rise in crime in the decades of the 60s through early 90s, and the decline. And I wonder if I know you're aware of that hypothesis. I wonder how much you attribute crime to lead, and as well as the decline.
Yeah, it's an interesting hypothesis. It was made famous by Kevin Drum in a Mother Jones article. It came out after Better Angels of Our Nature was published, so I didn't really have a chance to evaluate it. And I haven't seen follow-up studies. I think it'd be interesting to examine. I am somewhat skeptical because the effect of lead on crime would have to be via, of course, impaired brain functioning and less self-control, lower intelligence. And if it were true, you'd expect coinciding and in fact slightly preceding the crime statistics changes, say, in intelligence or in self-control, that the generations that caused the American crime boom in the 60s through the early 90s would also have a much lower IQ, and conversely, the generation since then, the IQ should have shot up. And since the IQ is quite closely related to lead exposure in a way that crime is several causal links removed. And as far as I know, that is not the case, likewise for other measures of self-control. So I remain a bit skeptical. I think most criminologists are skeptical for whatever that's worth, but I do agree that it's worth investigating. And in any case, it certainly was a good idea to get lead out of gasoline because of effects on kids' brains.
I was also made aware in the course of reading this book that the incarceration rate for Black Americans has been declining every year since 2001. And if you disaggregate by age, you find Black men aged 18 through 29. That cohort, the population has more than cut in half since 2001. That's not widely known, but it's an interesting feature of progress that is not often talked about.
I was not aware of that. That is interesting. And it is, I think it folds into it two trends. One of them is that the overall rate of violent crime has gone down since 1992, kind of leveled off in the first few years of the current century. And then against all expectations, it fell significantly again after the Great Recession of 2008, just when a kind of poverty causes crime theory would predict that violent crime would shoot up, and in fact, it went down even further. So, and anything that affects violent crime will, of course, affect incarceration rates for all races. But you're right that in addition to the fact there are just fewer people committing crimes of all races, there has been a de-incarceration movement, too slow and too late, but even conservative politicians have realized that this is imposing a big cost on the country. So there has been some movement to reducing incarceration, although there's still a lot of work to be done.
Okay, my final question for you, Dr. Pinker. I think many people are despairing right now. I try to always keep my pessimism in proportion, largely because I've read and been persuaded by your books on the fact that we tend to be more pessimistic than is warranted by the facts. What is your soundbite summary of the reasons to not completely despair at this moment during this pandemic and the nation on fire?
Yes, we've been through worse. We've been through much worse. And as you and I have discussed, you can the news feed gives you a biased sample of the worst things happening anywhere in the world on a given day. So that's the sample that we're getting. It's not a random sample. When things go right, they're generally not news. When things improve, it's usually incremental. It's a few percentage points a year, which then add up or even compound. But there's never a Thursday in October in which it happens all at once. And so it's just any informed person, if they are informed by the news, is bound to have a biased sample of what's going on in the world. The other thing to keep in mind is that our baseline of what we should expect should be calibrated pessimistically, paradoxically. But I think a lot of people have a mindset that the natural state of affairs is affluence and equality and knowledge and understanding and peace, and that if our world falls short, we must be doing something terribly wrong and things must be spiraling out of control. Whereas a better way of thinking about it is that our the natural state of life is that we are ignorant, we are prone to competition, including violent competition. That's natural selection uh, tilts us in that direction. We are vulnerable to disease. We are big, yummy hunks of protein and fat and cellular reproductive machinery that's just irresistible to little bitty organisms that evolve much faster than we do. The natural state of affairs is not wealth, but poverty, and wealth has to be created. When you understand the human condition as beginning with a baseline of deprivation, of competition, of ignorance, then you realize that our current shortcomings aren't kind of a scandal or crisis compared to what's natural, but rather just shows how much work is left to be done. And that it reminds us that human ingenuity and human sympathy, although um, finite and quirky, can be enhanced. And I would say it emboldens us to enhance these faculties, the better angels of our nature, if you want, that have eked out improvements in the past and that are what we have to work with to solve the problems facing us now.
All right. Thank you very much, Dr. Pinker.
It's been a pleasure, Coleman. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely.